Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/fpphilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
All right, welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by my co-host, Michael Granado.
Special shout out to Little John and the Eastside Boys.
What?
And Raymond Perrier.
How's it going, everybody?
I was listening to Little John today, and it just made me so nostalgic for growing up, listening to Little John.
We've been talking for an hour, and you hadn't mentioned Little John at all, so it just came out of left field.
Not once, no.
I mention Little John every day.
Do you?
Little John, if by chance you come across this podcast, you are more than welcome on our show.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I'm trying deeply hard not to let out a yeah. And with a terrible Little John impersonation.
It would be terrible.
You need to put it in post. You need to put it in post just like a Little John, yeah, in the background. Yeah.
We'll think about it.
Would that be some sort of copyright? Can you copyright your yeah? I don't know.
I'm sure you can, but let's be honest.
Maybe one of the 3 people.
Yeah, exactly. The first thing they're going to do is say, hey, take that off, in which case I'll just cut the end of the episode off and repost it. But before that, they're going to be like, Front Porch Philosophers, what? Who?
Who are these guys?
I feel like
Never
we could
heard of
probably
them.
just
They're not
we
gonna listen to
could
us.
get away with a lot of copyright infringement because 3 people listen to us.
Oh, for sure. Mark would probably report us. Mark's a stickler for the rules.
Damn it, Mark.
Mark, yeah. The
Our
one that's
patron.
our investor.
Our financial benefactor.
Our one supporter.
Anyway, shout out to Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Side note about one thing about Little John. So my first job was in the service industry. I cleaned doctors' offices as a teenager, and we'd have to wait till nighttime, and it was a crew of degenerates, and we would ride around. And at the time, I didn't have a car, so this redneck that I knew would come and pick me up in his jacked up pickup truck, and I mean you had to jump to get into the truck. It was obscene, and he would listen to just David Allan Coe and stuff like that. And the first time I heard Little John and the Eastside Boys, this is way back before they actually got popular, was actually with this dude. His name was Hayden. Hayden bought a record of Little John and the Eastside Boys specifically because on the cover, Little John was sporting a rebel flag belt buckle, and that was the impetus for him purchasing that record, if that lets you know what caliber of person he was, or is, I suppose.
Well, that just demonstrates how good of advertising Lil Jon was.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously appropriating a symbol, right? He's appropriating a symbol. I mean, because they were part of the early wave of Southern rap, but
This segues to our conversation that we're having on this wonderful evening, right?
yeah, just about racism and white ignorance and whatnot, which frankly is a conversation that we have a lot privately. We talk a lot about racism because we're all from the South, so it's something that we've lived around, have been privy to, have no doubt in unintentional ways participated in, and so it's something that we try to stay conscious of. And there's no shortage of examples of it in the news and just in life. So here we are talking about it again. This time we just happen to be recording it. So
Yeah, and I do want to point out that I think the topic white ignorance is a good topic for us, obviously, because we are white.
Exactly.
With the exception of Michael.
I'm only half white. Shout out to all the biracial folks out there.
Given that everything's, focused on BLM, and I didn't want to bring a black person on here as like a token speaker for BLM matters, I thought it was more appropriate if we just talked about white ignorance, because obviously growing up in the South, experiencing racism, like, Jared said, seeing it, unwittingly participating in, cultural and social forms of racism, no doubt. We can talk about that quite matter of factly, more so than a lot of people who don't understand the types of racism that are like emerging, like the ways that we talk about it as easily, because they're either just not a part of a place where there's a large, population of diversity, and they're not confronted with that, or they're just ignorant, like the term suggests. So, but Mike, you were going to give us a little background on that?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I could probably talk about this for like 3 hours, so just tell me to shut up when you're ready to talk. But what I think is really interesting about this from a historical perspective is kind of the unique place that the South occupies with this topic. Words like institutionalized racism or systematic racism get tossed around a lot, and oftentimes are devoid of any sort of historical context. But if you look at the history of the United States, of course, especially the history of the American South, and you study that history, you start to get a sense of what we mean when we talk about institutionalized racism and why racism is a systematic issue and not just a personal individual issue. It's not just about the, take your pick of whatever example you want to draw from. It's not just about the individual who expresses who throws out a racial slur, or it's not just about violence against a particular group of people. Like, this is something that is deeply embedded into American Southern culture. So much so that it's inescapable. We've had, as long as the U.S. South has existed, it has been a part of the U.S. South. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Can we focus in on that then? I just wanted to, because I think that that's a big distinction that we need to highlight: the institutional versus the structural, right? The systematic versus the individual. Because I think that that's where it gets confusing for people in trying to describe how racism pops up in those two different ways.
Well, in case you've somehow been living under a rock for the last, couple of years, if I'm to a point where I think it's difficult to imagine that someone who is actually interested in learning about racism hasn't, afforded themselves of all of the information which is now available about the distinction between like individual bigotry versus institutionalized racism. But just for the sake of clarity, let's say again, no doubt for most people, say again what the distinction is. It doesn't much matter if you have individuals who have bigoted beliefs about other categories of people, right? Anyone can be a bigot. Anyone can have negative views about any person based upon any sort of quality, right? It's pretty arbitrary. People hate people for any number of reasons. That's kind of uninteresting and not particularly important. What structural or systemic racism is about is the way in which power structures systematically disadvantage certain people based upon those arbitrary differences. And given the history of the United States, the 400-year history going back to 1619 when the first African slaves arrived in the Virginia colonies, there has been there's been chattel slavery followed by, systemic discrimination, which has been built into the very fabric of the institutions predating the country, right? So, like, when we talk about American racism, in particular American racism as it manifests itself in the South, we're talking about something which actually antedates the country itself. It's deeply ingrained in all of our institutions, beginning with the Constitution. We have the 3/5 clause within the Constitution. We have early laws against runaway slaves. If we look at, the early capitalist models within the North, for example, we even have, and this isn't just a Southern problem. I mean, it's particular to the South because the South has an agrarian economy, which relied upon the exploitation of black bodies for free labor. But the country as a whole benefited from, this unjust system. And in the North, you had direct involvement with things like northern insurance companies insuring property in the South, part of that property being black bodies. So it's a problem which...
The center of trade, too, right? The center of the slave trade. Well, the port of entry, you could say, of the slave trade into America was the Northeast. If you were getting slaves, and most of it, if you were getting slaves for the South, they were coming through those ports.
Well, some of it. I mean, you had big slave markets in Charleston.
Yeah, and in New Orleans,
correct
too.
me if I'm wrong, Mike, and Savannah as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, kind of speaking to, again, not to get uber technical about any of this stuff, because it's supposed to be philosophy podcast, not history podcast. But
we say we get to talk about whatever we want to, Mike. It's our podcast, and no one's listening but us and our wives anyway.
Exactly.
Not my wife, so.
Well, let me correct that. My wife isn't listening.
Yeah, my wife is.
Just Summer. Shout out Summer.
Hey, Summer.
Yeah, shout out to Summer, my lovely, beautiful wife. So yeah, I mean, major ports along the East Coast prior to the 19th century. I mean, the biggest obviously being New York. So most of the shipping industry situated in the Northeast. The largest ports on the eastern coast prior to the 19th century and still today being Charleston and Savannah, for sure. Also, some of the largest cities in the South. Again, Jared mentioned the fact that the South is largely agricultural. There are very few major cities in the South prior to the 19th century. And interesting historical tidbit, it's interesting to see how slavery operated in the city versus how slavery operated in the more rural agrarian South. Very interesting dynamics there, but we can skip that to talk about whatever. I do want to say super quickly, like, that all of this, for me anyways, is rooted in the history of the South. So I get a lot of pushback when, we're having conversations about racism and I bring up the issue of slavery. I've had conversations with kind of roll their eyes. Why is it all about slavery? 'Cause it kind of is. That's where it started. And how and where it started kind of dictates the pace and the views for the next, until the Civil War. So from the get-go, one of the most distinguishing factor about American slavery is it became predicated on racism. It is the enslavement of Africans, solely of Africans. And with that economic shift to just importing slaves from Africa is backed up and followed by cultural, at the time, biological assumptions about what race meant and what these people were like. That, as a result, becomes embedded into and a part of the legal and cultural system of the South.
Yeah, let's since we're on this, let's go ahead and clear out a couple of canards which are kind of in the popular discourse. First off, like Columbus. To the extent to which you can talk about Columbus discovering America, obviously, most people realize now how silly it is to talk about someone discovering something where millions of people live. But the transatlantic slave trade began with Columbus, right? He was the first transatlantic slave trader. A couple of things about this. The general argument about slavery was that because it was so predominant at the time, then we should just forgive people for engaging in this practice, yada yada yada. Even as early as Columbus, slavery was on its way out. He was quite the cheerleader for slavery, but Ferdinand and Isabella, the benefactors, which sent him looking for wealth in the Americas, didn't seem particularly interested in engaging in the slave trade. Not because they were good people. I mean, they were horrible people for other reasons. But Columbus wrote a lot of letters trying to encourage them to engage in the slave trade, and they didn't seem particularly interested. Slavery began with native peoples, and then, of course, we had the whole, history of indentured servitude with a lot of the poor from Western Europe coming to the Americas. But that was limited. Some of the distinctions, the core distinctions between the early slave trades involving native peoples and indentured servitude with respect to, for lack of a better term, white people coming to the Americas was that those were not based specifically on race, right? We took over native lands, and so they were enslaved on that basis. White people coming here, their children were not enslaved. You had contracts with the master to work for a particular amount of time. Doesn't mean that indentured servants were treated nice always, but they had more legal rights than chattel slaves, which is part of the impetus for transitioning to chattel slavery was you remove people's legal rights, and you can also enslave their children. The Irish, let me go ahead and just say, for anyone who could possibly be listening to this who doesn't already know this, the Irish were not slaves. Never, not at all, not once. That's something that, white racists trot out in order to say, well, black people should really get over slavery because the Irish were also slaves and you don't hear us whining about it, yada, yada, yada. It's not true at all, not even in the slightest. So just wanted to clear all of that garbage out before we proceed.
Yeah, that's a classic. I have a friend named Greg. Shout out to Gregory. We'll get him on the podcast eventually. But he likes to use this phrase, a whataboutism, right? So anytime we talk about the issue of slavery, or any issue really, but slavery, we see this especially, and Jared, you just brought it up. So if we're talking about like American slavery and how it's centered on African Americans, one of the objections that you get are, well, what about the Irish? What about the Native Americans, right? And some of these, for the Native Americans, there's more validity to it. As Jared explained, there are different reasons behind it. But even if we want to argue semantics and say, well, the Irish were in a form of slavery, that's a moot point, right? That doesn't diminish what happened with the African slave trade. It doesn't take away from the fact of what happened with the African slave trade.
Any more than acknowledging that the systematic, genocide of native peoples in the Americas, takes away or adds anything really to discussions of the systematic mistreatment of African Americans.
Exactly.
I mean, there are two instances of genocidal behavior on the part of dominant classes. I think that ultimately we don't have a good framework in American education for talking about these issues. One, because...
Oh, don't get me started, Jared. Don't bring up history classes. I'm going to pitch a fit on this podcast.
Well, all right. Anyway, we don't have a good interpretive framework for this because it's hard for us to look like the good guys. because we weren't. Like we are just the history of the United States has been a history largely of exploitation, and so it doesn't leave kids with the best picture of what the United States is. Even if you emphasize the high ideals which have been posed of liberty and equality for all, whatnot, our history has been one of not meeting those in really extravagant ways. But also, I think the best way to understand this, and of course where I'm going to go with this, is understanding capitalism. You can't understand the history of America without understanding the history of capitalism and the way in which the exploitative practices of capitalism eventuate in the absence of other conditions in something like slavery. Was there slavery prior to the development of capitalism? Certainly. Every society,
just about.
Maybe that's too broad. Most societies in human history have had some form of slavery. Slavery in the antebellum South, though, is something unique in human history. There's nothing else like it anywhere in history. And the only way that you can really understand it is through industrialization and capitalism. Those are the outlying factors which separate it. The profit motivation, the way in which industrialization changed how we think about labor, and in it just weaponized racism in a way that just society has never seen. And we're still dealing with the effects of it, and I don't think that we can properly combat the legacy of racism as long as the legacy is still propping up the beneficiaries. Right? So we can't properly address the legacy of slavery because the people who benefit from it are still benefiting from it. Right? The institutions which are still benefiting from the legacy of slavery continue to benefit from it. And so there's no way for us to properly address it without turning a critical eye onto those who continue to benefit from it. And I think that the powers that be simply don't have the stomach to do that because they will see the implications. They'll see themselves implicated in that legacy, and they're just not prepared to do it.
So, Ray, let me pose a question to you. Maybe you can bring us into the 21st century here with this discussion. So how would you say, because you have a history background as well as a philosophy background, how would you say that these historical causes, maybe the historical basis of this discussion, how do we segue from that to talking about systematic racism nowadays? How would you make that transition?
Well, I think in terms of helping somebody make the transition, or just like understanding the trajectory of like history on some like intellectual history. Is that what you're thinking?
Both.
So I think that it sort of comes down to a couple of things. I think two things. One of these goes to one of the things that Jared was talking about, and I think that that's recognizing that alongside of the industrialization and the capitalization of the Western world comes also some really bad anthropological, and when I mean anthropological, I don't mean like the traditional sense of it, but of the scientific study, but really like the philosophical study of anthropology, and recognizing others like with black and brown skin as being savages or lesser than, creating these weird categorical distinctions that I don't think that I have seen in the study of history really existed in previous forms of slavery. Or at least not to the sense that it did when we see it in the 1800s and the 1700s. So if you understand that there's this sort of psychological aspect, then we can then, in this sort of like underlying lack of awareness that there are these category mistakes we're making when we look at other people, then it's easier to understand that this then gets written large into structures within society and then it shows like, and here's where we can start pointing at ignorance. Like there's a connection between what concepts or what categories of existence are shaping your world and how you're using those to see the world, and then how that is writ large into institutional policies that affect everybody, right? So that, I think that would be a good starting point.
Well, I think that, what you're describing, well, I'd say part of what you're describing is the history of scientific racism.
Part of it, yeah.
Which sounds, if you're just hearing that phrase for the first time, then that sounds oxymoronic to talk about scientific racism. But really, the history of racism can't be decoupled from the progress of science, particularly through the late 18th, early mid-19th century. And onwards, honestly, through the early 20th century with eugenics. The compulsion to classify and to distinguish and then to create hierarchies. These are kind of impulses which are within science that I'm sure that Mike could talk about with greater clarity than myself. But those impulses, when turned towards individual differences in human culture, largely comes down to, if you go back and look at earlier developments within the scientific literature, what you see is people basically beginning with the assumption that their society represents the top of the hierarchy, and then just trying to explain, utilizing scientific language, why everyone else should be seen as qualitatively lesser than themselves. Up to and including putting actual Africans in zoos, right? Putting actual, people, human beings, kidnapped, put in zoos next to apes. Like, that's where that leads you.
I'll jump in here real quick a little bit, just because I think this history is so fascinating, and then I want to get back to this idea of ignorance that you brought up, Ray. But super quickly, the justifications within the context of American slavery and within the context of the slave trade in general, beginning in the Enlightenment, you do have several different scientific justifications for racism. This begins with the belief, an early biological belief, that different races of people are actually distinct races. This comes from an early view of biology which believed that different species have continued more or less in their same form to exist throughout history. So like the dog that you see nowadays was the same sort of dog that you would see 5 million years ago. And then the same sort of concept was applied to human beings. And so these different categories, like white people and Africans, Europeans and Africans, were viewed as separate species in a way. Of course, this starts to radically change in the 19th century with the introduction of evolutionary biology, beginning with Lamarck and culminating in Darwin. But it's still there. So this is what is really fascinating. So Darwin puts an end to that sort of biological thinking. And in fact, Darwin, in his Descent of Man, makes the claim that all human beings originated from the same place, which happened to be Africa, and that all human beings are a part of the same species, which completely derailed any sort of argument for biological racism. It just doesn't make sense anymore. But people like ignored that and said, oh, Darwin's arguing for progress. Darwin's arguing for species getting better. And so people ignored that part of Darwin and instead focused on this aspect that, well, Europeans represent the accumulation of biological evolution, and that Europeans are, as a result, biologically superior to, let's say, Africans who are not as developed.
And can I say that, just as an aside, for philosophical thinkers out there who are familiar with this time period, I don't think it's any great mistake that would go on, given that the works of Darwin and people like Hegel people who are like reading history in these large narratives, it's only a step apart to then go, oh yeah, and then there's like these. So to clarify, these historical narratives where there's a high point in history, like an apex, where this is like the best that it'll ever be, right? So you see this in religious thinking where we go from primitive religions to lesser religions to then Christianity as being like the apex, and you see this in a lot of traditions, but in particular that.
Well, I think that you can contrast this, right? So there's a shift. So if you look at someone like Gibbons talking about, the distinction between like the Golden Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, whatnot, then you see a lot of discussion early on about there was this golden period, right, when human beings were perfected, and it largely is a secularization of the notion of the fall. So like human beings used to be great, we fell away from greatness, and then there's just been this succeeding stages of falling away from greatness. So you see, this is particularly true amongst the romantics, right? This idea that there's this, we are living in now kind of degenerate times, and that if we could recapture the golden ages of the past, that's how we move ahead as a society, is by reacquiring our previous greatness, right? But then you contrast that with someone like Hegel, right, who thinks that we are in kind of this upward trajectory, right? Through the dialectic, we're progressing as a species, right? And some of that progressive notion really informs philosophical thinking of all kinds up until the First World War, where the notion of human progress is just kind of disintegrated. It dies in the trenches with an entire generation of young people. But there was this progressive notion that essentially human beings started out primitive, and that there's been this upward mobility. And the only place that you still see this kind of thinking, I believe, is amongst some kind of scientific people who continue to talk about the progress of technology in this sort of way, which I think ignores a lot of human development. Steven Pinker comes to mind, right? Kind of popularizer of this notion, who just seemed to ignore the genocides of the 20th century and things like that. So yeah, there's these tendencies. You can kind of think of us falling away from a golden age, or us beginning in the primitive muck and moving forward. And both of these can be weaponized to justify racism. That's the really strange, awful, fascinating thing about racism, is it's so amorphous, because ultimately it has no real justifications. So it gloms itself on to whatever thinking is available in order to perpetuate itself, because at the end of the day, racism, to my mind, is all about creating hierarchies where you're privileging yourself over against others. And that will take on whatever form is necessary to justify in the minds of people who are receiving undue benefits that the inequality in society is natural and correct. And so you can justify that by saying, well, we began in this golden age, and now because of degenerates like X, Y, Z, right, they're corrupting society, and so we have to purge them from society in order to reclaim our former glory, right? So that's one form in which a narrative can justify racism, which is to say that we have to get rid of these undue influences which are corrupting society, so that we can be who we should be. The other is to say, well, these type of people are not as evolved as us, and that's the reason why there's inequality in society. Not because the deck has been stacked against them and we, have artificially isolated a group of people away from these people so that we can continue that sort of thinking. It doesn't matter what the justification is, because at the end of the day, all it's really doing is trying to convey into the minds of the racist that hierarchies are natural and good. Which is the reason why I say you can't address racism without talking about capitalism, because capitalism does the same goddamn thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Capitalism is all about creating artificial hierarchies and then trying to convey in the minds of people that they are both natural and good and orderly, and that any sort of things which move towards a more egalitarian society are fundamentally unnatural and undesirable. I cede my time.
We should talk then about how ignorance sort of reveals different aspects of racism, because I think the racism that you focused in on there, Jared, um, doesn't it? It's ignorance in the sense that people are just wrong, or they're just being stupid, or they're just selfish, whatever it might be. They're just hateful. It could get, I think it can get that deep. But there's also white ignorance of, the left leaning liberals who are literally they just don't understand. They're confused, or they haven't thought about, or they don't understand how the system works well enough to recognize that that other people aren't receiving the same benefits and access and advantages that they are. It takes a lot to just remind people that, one, slavery didn't happen that long ago. We haven't even passed 200 years of separation.
There are literally people alive who are the children of slaves.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that, there are literally still people alive who are the children of slaves, not just the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great, the children of slaves.
Yeah. And then people underestimate the economic advantage of being basically included into the best parts of the economic society. And just don't understand how much generational wealth, even at the lower end of like Americans' economy, is still giving great advantage to people over people who are coming from black families who were slaves and then held back intentionally by laws and Jim Crow era stuff, and excluded from white businesses, and excluded from white education, and excluded from the resources, all kinds of things, right? And so I don't think people really understand what that means. They haven't calculated those things. They haven't gone. It's not that they may have like a passing awareness that something is different, but I don't think they can really put their finger on it, because it involves different language, a different way of looking at society than what has been ingrained in people. And that's also something that I want to talk about, because there's a lot of discussion about it being, quote unquote, implicit bias, right? Just white ignorance and institutional racism go hand in hand, because those people who participate in the institution in some way, shape, or form think that they're doing everything to be egalitarian. They don't dislike black people. They don't dislike Hispanics. Anytime something comes up, they try to support that. Yet at the same time, there are so many limits placed on these other communities, and I just don't think a lot of people grasp that. We should talk about that a little bit as being just different than like the white bigot with a Confederate flag in their truck, talking about how they hate black people for whatever reason.
Which I think that we should point out, like all of us having lived in the South, like, yeah, that definitely exists, but it doesn't represent most people in the South, even most racists in the South.
Not even close to the majority of racism today.
It's kind of, it's Hollywood racism.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, part of the problem with trying to address this with, white liberals in, urban areas outside of the South. Ray and I both lived in Southern California at some point, and I don't know if he's had this experience, but I'll say, trying to explain to people who grew up in Southern California, what the South is like, and trying to explain that racism isn't a matter of lack of proximity. So I think that a lot of people get the impression from movies and television, which of course we should admit, if you haven't traveled widely outside of the place in which you were born, the way that you learn things is through, cultural references and whatnot. So no shame in learning things that way, but it's worth clarifying if you've had the experience to point out that that's not the way that racism really works for most people in the South.
Yeah.
Racism is not a matter of if white people could just be around black people more, then they would learn that the stereotypes don't apply to them, and magically, you would come to the realization that we're not so different after all, and make an embrace, right? And so all these white savior movies and all these movies which are made about the reconciliation, like, oh, I was a Klan leader, but then I befriended this black lady because I was forced to, and now, I'm not a racist anymore. That's not how that works. A generation ago, white people had black people in their house as, as domestics, right? If you were well off in the South and white, then you had black people who cooked and cleaned for you, black people who raised your children for you. And so you have a generation of people who were raised by black people, surrounded by black people, in communities, many of which are majority black. It's not a matter of not being close to black people. It's about realizing that the disadvantages are not cultural, right? That the disadvantages don't stem from black people being lazy or stemming from black people having an inadequate culture. It stems from systemic and consistent disadvantage, which is built into a system. And this is really hard to explain to people in the South, particularly poor white people, because I grew up lower middle class. And if you grew up lower middle class in the South, having a conversation with white people is difficult because what they will insist, white racists in the South will insist that it's actually them who is discriminated against, right? Because they're not getting any support from the government, even though most of them are on welfare and just don't apparently admit that to themselves. But they seem to think that all of these benefits which come along with you probably have to cut this part out. Let me rephrase. All of the attempts to rectify systemic racism, things like scholarships for African Americans or whatnot, they see as racist because they can't qualify for them. But the issue has to do with the fact that even if you were lower middle class or poor and white in the South, you're not lower middle class and poor because you're white, right? And if you had any opportunities for upward mobility, your race would not be a barrier to them. And just because other people who were also facing systemic discrimination have some avenues to help them doesn't necessarily mean that you are being discriminated against. Our friend Kirsten, been on the show, shout out to Kirsten, she said before, and I think she didn't originate this, I should say. She'd be the first to admit that, I think. But she's fond of saying that if you are privileged, the loss of privilege feels like discrimination, right? So the loss of an undue advantage can feel discriminatory to the people who are enjoying it. But just because other people are getting something that you have enjoyed previously doesn't mean that, one, you've lost it. And even if you did lose it, it was an unfair advantage in the first place. So you're not being discriminated against. People are actively trying to balance things out, as it were.
And I will say, and this is where the institutional versus the individual, we've kind of laid that out. A lot of what is going around right now in terms of understanding how white ignorance is sort of waking itself up, right? That's where the idea of woke gets its name from, is, understanding these systemic and institutional advantages that have been given to white people and have been taken away from black people and brown people. But I also want to point out, because you brought it up a little bit, Jared, that is different from cultural racism. But I think that cultural racism is more familiar to people right now, at least in the South, right? So if we laid out the three forms we've talked about so far of racism, the first and the worst one is just biological or naturalized racism, right? You're black, I'm white, you're brown, we're like different species, basically. We've gotten rid of that because that's stupid, and science supports, that it's stupid. that's not an issue. Those are stupid people.
Let me interrupt you 1 second and say I'd like to think that we've gotten rid of it, but then you listen to people like Sam Harris defend like differences in IQ between black people and white people, and you go, scientific racism seems like it's
Yeah.
making a comeback, and it's making a comeback amongst people who like to think of themselves as just, I'm just asking questions, and why are you afraid of the
Yeah.
facts? The facts just point to the data. The data points to differences in IQ between black people and white people. So
I was just saying we got rid of it, like we've dispensed with it as a problematic form of racism. Not that it's like gone in the world. And there's almost certainly places worse than America even, where it's still like very much alive and well. So we've dispensed with it. It's a piece of trash, like all forms of racism, but particularly cultural racism though is so growing up in the South, you the white communities and the black communities, the majority of them live together. They cohabitate, but they have very, very different cultural perspectives, and they participate oftentimes in isolation culturally, even at the same level even if like we're talking about a poor white family and a poor black family, they will oftentimes share common things, but they also oftentimes have very separate cultural values and like just ways of looking at the world. A lot of racism that I've seen in the South stems from I don't like that, and it's always some sort of cultural thing. I don't like the way you dress. I don't like the way you wear your hair. I don't like the way you talk. A lot of that can be rooted back to cultural differences, and just closed-mindedness. And I think that that's where that in distinguishing that from economic forms of racism, the institutional, I think that that's where people struggle to transfer from one to the other. Like they just don't understand how an institution can be racist when they have rules like equal opportunity and things like that, right? Like these sort of catchphrases we're using to try and make it look like things are equality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you spend any time around bigots in the South, like you're less likely to hear someone explicitly say, "I don't like black people," than you are to hear some dude complaining about people walking around with their pants, with their underwear hanging out or something like that, or making fun of certain diction, right? Ebonics, as it were.
Yeah.
Making fun of those things. That's when people kind of reveal themselves as being racist in a kind of transparent way, but it's rarely someone just openly confessing that they have a disparaging belief of others. People in the South racists in the South are quick to point out that they don't think of themselves as racist, right?
Yes. And you see like a racist when approached by a black person in like a nice pair of pants or slacks, a button down, nice watch, wearing good looking shoes, and a sports jacket, walking out of a bank or like a Kroger or whatever, right? Their local store, they'll treat that individual different because they feel like there's more familiarity. They feel similar to them. Like they're doing what I would do. They're seeking the things that I seek. And so on top of like this guy's wearing, like a wife beater and a short unbuttoned shirt with like jeans hanging around his crotch with his underwear sticking out versus this guy in a suit. There's this weird conflation too that you're one of us because you're wearing all this. So it's this other odd reverse racism, as if black people couldn't just decide to dress the way they wanted and not like assimilate. That's always like a perception that they've somehow assimilated, which I've had a lot of my black friends here in Vicksburg. They get really frustrated with that because they're like, man, I like Nautica. Like I like looking fly, and if anything, I feel like y'all are dressing like me. So this is like weird reversals,
Well,
right?
there's this weird thing that people do, which is to say, all right, white people are just white people, right? Like I don't see a redneck walking around dressed, poorly, for lack of a better word. Again, all this is relative, right? I mean, you dress how you want to dress, and you shouldn't be judged for it. But if you're dressing in a way in which the culture does not see you as a professional, I guess is the best way to talk about it.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
If you're dressed in such a manner, and you're a white person, you see a person like that, it's just transparent to you. You don't think about it, right? And you, again, if you see a white person in a suit, you don't think anything special about that either. They're just a person. They're a person first. And you don't really think much about their clothing other than making probably some assumptions about how much money they have or whatnot. When a white person sees a black person dressed in a way which is not approved by the wider culture, right, then that somehow becomes something about their personhood, about their character. It becomes a flaw which can be generalized to the culture, right? So it becomes a problem for black people that this one dude is not dressed a specific way. And then when they see a black person dressed in a way which is approved or held up as a standard by the culture, then it still becomes a problem because they go, why can't the rest of you look like this guy, right? Why can't you be better, right? And you just don't have that sort of mentality amongst white people viewing other white people.
Yeah. And just to highlight some of these points with some examples, and also to bring up a historical point real quick, as everyone listening to this probably knows, but slavery ended with the American Civil War. You have the Emancipation Proclamation followed by the 13th Amendment. But what's really interesting about this is, first and foremost, the people who were in power prior to the Civil War still remained in power after the Civil War. So although the institution of slavery was dismantled, it really just took another form. And although racism, like explicit racism, we saw a decline in explicit racism, it just kind of morphed into other cultural things. So you have slavery that's replaced with the former slaves now working on the plantation, getting paid for it, but you have basically another form of indentured servitude.
Sharecropping. Right?
Sharecropping. And then you have things like, okay, well, we can't be slaves anymore, but then you have the institution of like chain gangs and the beginning of the police force in the American South. The police force in the American South has a long, really interesting history. Would encourage you to go look it up. And then culturally, I've had this conversation a lot, and kind of hearing y'all talk made me think of a specific cultural example. So the South is oftentimes associated with the Bible Belt. The South, overtly religious, overtly Christian. I mean, I'm in Savannah, Georgia right now. On the corner, a block from my house, there's literally 4 churches, a church on each corner.
There's also a big cross in your neighbor's yard pointed at your house.
That's right, because my house number happens to be 666. But side point.
Oh my
right?
gosh.
It's just a benefit that came with the house. But one of the interesting cultural things is the religious divide, right? So a lot of these former slaves, of course, became Christians, but weren't allowed in the white churches, so they formed their own churches. And you might think, well, yeah, okay, cool, that happened 150 years ago. The South is still largely segregated when it comes to places of worship. Right, look at the South on a Sunday morning.
MLK said one time, like, the most segregated hour in America is, Sunday morning at whatever time, But so,
right, it just kind of reinforces this cultural difference that emerged.
Well, I think that some of that too has to do with the way in which a fair amount of white Christianity was weaponized as well as a means of supporting those racist institutions. Like white Christianity in America, by and large, I mean, there's a lot of notable counterexamples to this, but by and large, white Christianity in America has been used as a weapon against black people. In as much as black Christianity has been the avenue through which a lot of dissent has happened, white Christianity has countered it. I think one of the interesting things, so I grew up in the Pentecostal Holiness Church, and the Pentecostal Holiness Church is a charismatic movement, and the modern charismatic movement began in Kansas and also began in California on Azusa Street. And the origins of the California institution really began with, some African Americans. And so you can cut some of that out because I'm getting a bit washed on some of this. Anyway, let me back up and say I grew up in the Pentecostal Holiness Church. And the Pentecostal Holiness Church in the South is a charismatic movement. And the charismatic movement had some interesting overlaps with black churches, particularly the AME Church. And they are Congregationalist churches for the most part, right? Which means that church order is largely determined by that particular church. There's not a huge hierarchy in Congregational churches. I mean, technically, if it's a denominational church, then they, pay some dues to the denomination, but ultimately, most of the church governance is conducted in-house. And so there would be churches affiliated with Pentecostals in town. There would be one which everyone knew was kind of more socially conservative, and they were all white. But then the church that I grew up in was integrated, which was pretty unique in the South. And one of the odd things was the kind of white liberals in town, to the extent there are white liberals in small southern towns, would go to mainline churches, right, Methodist churches or Presbyterian churches, and they would no doubt condemn racism from the pulpit and think of themselves as progressive, but there are no black people in their churches, right? And the odd kind of social dynamic of being in a Pentecostal church was you would have a number of black families in what is predominantly a white church. And so people who carry on kind of racist ideas in their daily life think of themselves as somehow more progressive on the matter of race because they are in this integrated space. And they don't ever talk about racism because they were afraid that it would lead to some sort of tension that they don't want to deal with. And so the black people and the white people basically code switch whenever they're around each other to diminish their differences, to exaggerate their similarities, and it's really odd to look at. It's really odd to look at.
Did you have another distinction you wanted to draw, Ray? I feel like we kind of missed one of your definitions there.
No, I think it's been helpful because in the process of this, I also realized that the political atmosphere right now has been really, really, really focusing heavily on institutional racism, which I think largely deals with economic disadvantages, which is all good and well and fair, and I think absolutely points to the truth of things. But it also occurred to me that I think when you think of red states versus blue states, given the propensity for blue states to be states that have really large urban areas, it occurs to me that I feel like one of the reasons institutional racism makes so much sense to them is because it's just writ so large in these places. I mean, when you go to a place like California, California is not without racism. Their biggest form of racism is toward the Hispanic community, but there's also an anti-black racism there, and it comes in the form of the institution mainly through economic and class distinction. It's just city to city when you're driving.
Redlining's bigger. Yeah, redlining's bigger in the cities.
Yeah, the coding and the ordinances and the separations and all the rules they have in all these urban areas, because that's how they develop. You don't see that in places like Mississippi. In my county, there's not a single ordinance or code that would prevent you from doing whatever you want on your plot of land, which means that you have like $200,000 homes, which is a really expensive home here. That's like $1.5 million mansion in California because the price difference is so cheap. But then next door, somebody has a plot of land and they throw a trailer on there, and they're literally, and you just drive by both. There's no rules, and you just don't see that in places like California often. They just push all of the wealth in one direction, and they keep all the poor in the other. And what it does is it exaggerates those racial divides because it becomes so clear who's poor and who's not, and how do you cross the tracks, so to speak. But you don't really get that as much in Mississippi. I mean, you do. You have like really wealthy neighborhoods where you'd be very surprised to see a black person because it's the same here to some extent, but it's not written large, you know. So I think that that's an interesting difference, because then it is like Southerners experience cultural racism on a more profound level than they do systematic racism, because it feels more like everybody is in the same boat, as far as like the economic disadvantages go. Though that's not true.
Just a point. I think that's part of the reason why I think that the Hollywood racism I mentioned looks the way it does, is they kind of glom on their experience of racism, which is like for real segregate in a way that you just could not do in the South. Like the South was obviously segregated to say like you can't use this bathroom or whatnot, but you can't segregate people in the South to say like this part of the city, right? Because cities aren't as big of a thing. Again, it's not like there's not redlining and things like Atlanta or whatnot. But I feel like, again, the distinction that you're making is to say that if you drive in California, if you're in an upper crust neighborhood, the racial dynamic is pretty clear in a lot of that. Maybe less so these days, right? Maybe less so these days. But the racial dynamic is pretty intentional. In the South, as you said, there's just a lot more overlap. And so it gets to the real absurdity of segregation, because if you go back to the 50s, you would have people who were preparing your food, right, who were watching your kids, who could not use your bathroom, right? And it's just the nonsensical nature of that is just kind of astounding. Like the more that you think about it, the crazier it gets. But one thing which I think is important, especially in this conversation where Ray and I are unambiguously white. Mike is ethnically half white, but I mean he's a Latino guy. It's worth pointing out that in conversations like this, we are implicated in this. We're not the good guys, right? We're not the voices that people should be listening to. Like, I just want to make that clear, right? Like, if you're listening to this, I mean, I'm glad you're part of the conversation. That's fine, but you should really be listening to black people, right? You should really be listening to Latino people. You should really be listening to the experiences of women and other people, other people who are marginalized by society, if you want to find out about those issues.
Just point out real quick, maybe we can say some resources. If you like philosophy, if you're interested in like issues of race, I absolutely love Cornel West, probably one of my favorite philosophers. Fantastic book, Race Matters. Check it out. Absolutely worth the read.
Yeah, the point is to say, like, one of the hang-ups that I have in a lot of these conversations is we white people tend to have like a savior mentality, and we think that now that we are aware of a situation that we're going to fix it, right? But as I've said probably on here before, I'll say it again, racism isn't a problem that you can fix. It's a tendency, an impulse that needs to be resisted, particularly if you are in a class of what kind, whatever kind in society, which enjoys some sort of benefits. Being male affords you some benefits. Being straight affords you some benefits. Being, lily white affords you some benefits. Not across the board, right? There are situations in which those are not necessarily advantages for you, but by and large in our society, those are all huge advantages. Being able-bodied, right, means that you have a society which is built for you, all right? Like, I don't have to worry about if the place I'm going to go has a wheelchair ramp, right? If a courthouse didn't have a wheelchair ramp just because they didn't consider, me and I happen to be, even the very notion of being disabled assumes something about the nature of embodiment, right? You're only disabled in a society which hasn't made room for you and doesn't make assumptions about. Anyway, the point is to say, if you enjoy any benefits in society whatsoever, then you should really be listening to people who are disadvantaged in those ways. It doesn't make you a bad person necessarily to be white. It doesn't make you any more than it makes you a bad person to be able-bodied, right? Or to be straight. But if you refuse to recognize the benefits which come along with those things, right? If you are not a good ally and, try to take stock of the ways in which you've benefited as opposed to others, help other people who don't enjoy those benefits, and then, every once in a while, I know we're not doing it here, but every once in a while, just shut the fuck up and let other people talk. Like, we shouldn't be leading the charge, as it were. And some people will say, well, that's just white guilt, and why these people, they've internalized self-hatred and all this stuff. That's bunk, right? It just means that you are not always the most important voice in a room. Sometimes it's best to sit back and listen, to learn things, and also to recognize that, we are just gonna make mistakes, right? I'm sure that in my life I've said plenty of dumb shit to black people, and they have been kind enough and patient enough and considerate enough to not make me, feel terrible for making a mistake. And that is something I probably in those instances did not deserve. I didn't deserve for them to be nice to me with me, making an ass out of myself, but they did, and I learned from the experience in the exchange. So
You want to wrap it up for us, Ray?
Closing remarks for me, I just wanted to say that the purpose of this, as Jared was pointing out, is really just to add clarity to what white ignorance is from some ignorant white folks who thought about it long enough and are talking about it
and learn more every day. Learn more every day about how ignorant we are.
Yeah, exactly. So this will give hopefully some clarity to people who are trying to figure out where they fit in all of this and where they're at on the sort of ignorant scale. So tune in next time for I think we're going to do an episode on comedy. Maybe it'll be more fun and lighthearted than this. We'll see.
I mean, us talking about comedy?
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
We're not very funny, but, we're good at ragging on other people.
If any comedian wants to come onto the show,
well, we'll talk. I've got a buddy who might join us. So, anyways,
okay.
I have an open invitation to Dave Chappelle.
Oh God, yes.
For every episode, but he's yet to have taken me up on it.
I send him emails every day. Hey Dave, will you come on our podcast, please?
Maybe I'll get some. I'm publishing in that pop culture book with him, or not with him, but on him.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
That comes up in a couple of weeks. The first draft.
Awesome, dude.
Yeah, we're gonna. That's the guy I want to bring in. Is the guy that turned me onto that. He'd be fun.
Oh hell yeah.
So, anyways, let's wrap it up.
All right. Well, until next time, boys and girls.
Deuces.
Says what? Peace.
All right, I'm about to piss my pants. So.
All right. Night, fellas. See you guys next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Front Porch Philosophers. If you did, go follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch. If you liked it so much that you want to support us monetarily, then go to patreon.com/fpphilosophers and become a $1 subscriber today. Every dollar goes to adding more content and buying up more server space, so the more you spend, the more you get. In any case, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Front Porch.